Meko, John Meko. Those of you that are just joining us, John and I have known each other for years, and I just found out 2 days ago that I've been butchering his last name the entire time I've known him. And apparently he's just never heard me pronounce his last name before until we did that promo video.
It was on a LinkedIn promo video. Yes, exactly.
And he's never had an opportunity to correct me. And no one has ever corrected me when I've mentioned his name to somebody else. So goodness gracious.
It was good to have colleagues reaching out to me, asking me if they were pronouncing my name wrong all of these years. So it's a good impetus.
How often you get pronounced like Meko, like the shark instead of Meko?
That's a common one as well. Meko is the most popular. Meko is definitely the most popular butchering of the name.
Yeah.
It's not a common one, in fairness.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna give everyone. I see people are starting to trickle in, so we're gonna give another minute or two, and then we'll get this kicked off. So we'll say that I'm super excited to get this series up and off the ground. I think this is really just looking at taking a different take on things. John is, we get in, especially over the last few years when we've been through COVID and everyone's been on the Zoom meetings and the web meetings, and you get fatigued because you hear the same dry conversation over and over again. I was just like, why don't we do something different?
Yeah.
Right. Why don't we add a little jovialism to it, if that's even a word? I'm not even sure if that is a word.
It's not a word.
All right. Well, we'll get this started, everyone. So really appreciate you all tuning in today. This is the very first episode of I Be Thinking About. Today on the first episode, I be thinking about you. I'd be thinking about, in our competitive office environment right now, how do we leverage the investments of smart building technology, smart infrastructure to attract the tenants? Right now, we are in a market where I think the office environment is about as competitive as it's ever been. You've got occupiers that are allowing their leases to expire, and they're looking at where are they going to consolidate in for their future home. And as an owner of real estate, are you positioning your assets as a have or a have not? And today I've invited my friend John Meko to join me to have this conversation. John is the Global Director of Operations for WiredScore and SmartScore. John, thank you for joining us today and having this chat with me.
It's an honor. World premiere.
And this is a topic that I think for your entire organization is pretty near and dear to your heart. And for those of that do not know you, why don't you just give a quick rundown of your background, tell them a little bit about yourself, and we'll get this ball rolling.
Yeah, well, thank you all for attending. I've been with WiredScore for about 8 years now. As of 2 days ago, actually, I had my 8-year anniversary. Before that, I came up in the telecommunications industry, basically cut my teeth building fiber networks in the New York City metro, kind of like long haul dark fiber routes from city to city, connecting, kind of the class A, class B assets in New York to, dense fiber networks to basically enable tenant connectivity. Around the same time in 2013, WiredScore started, which was Wired NYC. Basically, formulated to provide tenants with transparency to kind of what was under the hood in buildings as it related to connectivity. A lot of information out there on, amenities and, all the features of buildings, but not a lot by way of, can I actually move into this facility and seamlessly connect to the internet in a way where I can run my business? So I left the telecommunications industry at a time where we sold our company. Came into WiredScore kind of right as we were growing nationally, solving that same challenge, which we thought was just a New York City challenge, turned out to be a national and ultimately an international challenge, and have kind of built out the operations side of the business over the years. So that team now is kind of the front lines of delivering our certifications with our clients and with their teams. We work hand in hand with architects, engineers, consultants, building owners, developers, property managers to basically help them to understand what they have within their assets as it relates to connectivity in building technology, smart technology, ultimately what they can do to improve those assets, and finally what you could do to market those assets, how you can position those uniquely within the market based on the investments you've made from a technology standpoint. So that has grown substantially over the years. We're now in about over 30 countries. We've got about 4,000 buildings certified. Kyle, I know you've worked on SmartScore specifically over the last few years, and that's a product that we launched about a year and a half ago. We're now up to about 280 projects somewhere in the certification process, either pursuing or finalized globally. So.
And I not only had the opportunity to participate in the front end consulting before that product was even a product. I was one of the people that participated and consulted on how that was going to be structured. And now Intelligent Buildings, our organization, we've got, between myself, Andy Schomburger, and Alexis, we've got 3 SmartScore APs on our staff.
Love it.
Yeah. Now, John, what SmartScore and WiredScore is all about, I think, is very relevant in really what's going on right now in our office environments. Where and I'm curious to hear from you. So you're right there in New York. You're in the epicenter of real estate for North America. Some of the other major metros may turn their nose up to that, but that's neither here nor there. In New York, right? Curious, both from the occupier side and from the owner side, and even from the investor side, like what are some of the behaviors now as the market is doing what it's doing? What are the behaviors that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bloodbath at the moment, as you said. It's the headlines are doom and gloom. I read an article yesterday from Cranes, which was the 5 stages of grief for New York City landlords, which is basically starting at denial and now coming to acceptance. But I mean, I think New York as a whole is indicative of the wider market, but the data from 2022 is actually pretty telling. We talk and hear a lot about, which is now kind of an overused term, which is the flight to quality. Mm-hmm. New York is the epicenter of that, and the data kind of lends itself to that being the case. Why is that? You've got some major headwinds that are global, but especially felt in the New York metro, which is a commuter city. You've got hybrid coupled with aging building stock, right? No one wants to spend time in an office that is, dingy, old, outdated, where they can focus more from home. Corporates are focused on sustainability and ESG, and a lot of our buildings are just pretty far behind where they need to be able to meet those requirements. As a result, we're at, a 70% increase in vacancy and office availability since March of 2020, which is, obviously a staggering number. That's mainly Class B and Class C assets that are essentially just bleeding tenants. Mm-hmm. The bright side of that is you look at, 2022, and you had over 200 leases at least $100 per square foot or more, which is a historic high. So what that tells you is, tenants are paying more for less, right? They're downsizing their footprints. They're rationalizing their portfolios, and they're looking for locations that they can truly use to kind of draw employees into wanting to be in the office. If you do a click down on that, like those leases are, again, predominantly Class A or redevelopments that are, recently upgraded, new construction, highly amenitized buildings that are near mass transit, either Grand Central or Penn Station. Those are the winners in the market, and those are the ones that are kind of doing the best as it relates to still attracting, highly desirable tenants in long-term leases. Kind of the flip side of that is that, the landlords kind of have to rationalize their approach, right? You can't sit on those aging buildings any longer. The article that came out recently from the CEO of RXR, Scott Reckler, kind of called that process of evaluating your portfolio Project Kodak. Essentially evaluate which of your portfolio is digital, which of your portfolio is film. For the percentage that's digital, double down, invest, focus on, continuing to upgrade the experience in those buildings and, future proof as it relates to technology. for the assets that are film, you kind of have to look yourself in the mirror and evaluate what you want to do. In some cases, it might be, a full repositioning, a full tear down. You're seeing a lot of buildings just sell at a loss, which is unfortunate, but, it's kind of a necessary evil in this market because, it's a great reset. You've got to kind of revalue these assets at a more kind of realistic baseline that will attract more outside investment that's sitting on the sidelines to kind of get those assets to a point of, being able to compete in this market. And just, sitting on those, not investing in them isn't really an option for most owners. CEO of RXR said in some cases, it just may make sense to return those assets to the lender, right? Because
give it back to the bank.
yeah,
Well, it's great for the third party managers because the banks aren't going to be able to manage those assets themselves. So this new business for them.
it's exactly it.
Let me ask you, so you think the days of having this massive foyer of, ridiculously expensive imported marble and having these, multi-million-dollar rooftop terraces with all the fancy little spots to drink your coffee, are those, is that dying then? Are we not going to see investments into that type of thing anymore? Because as a consulting company, when we go and we start talking about amenities with a lot of the owners out there, they're very quick to show us all of the fancy physical things that are in that building, like the floor to ceiling marble and all of that in the foyer. But is that enough? Is that what today's employee that you are trying to bring into these offices, do they care?
Yeah, I think if you asked me that questions 4 years ago, it would probably be, yes, that's enough. We were at a, all-time high in rent, negative vacancy rates, pretty easy to make low lift upgrades to your building and stay competitive. I'll never forget one of my first projects working in the city. I walked in, it was recently renovated. They redid the lobby. I was meeting with the building engineer to do a walkthrough. And I complimented him. I said, this is amazing. This lobby looks great. I'd been there years prior. It was terrible. So congrats. This is a great upgrade for your building. And he said to me in very, New York City building engineer fashion, lipstick on a pig. Wait till you see the rest of it, right? So he took me through the rest of the building, and the infrastructure was outdated. The telecommunications infrastructure was, complete rat's nest. So I think in years past, those were the kind of improvements that were getting prioritized, the soonest and the easiest to justify, because ultimately they matter, and they still do matter. You need to pass the eye test with the corporate real estate team. You need to have a space that's inviting and, fosters some sense of innovation and inspirational experience coming into the building for the users. Mm-hmm. But if that's all you're doing from a functionality standpoint, you're going to lose. You're going to be in for some pretty short leasing tours, right? People are more sophisticated. They want to know what's under the hood. They care about sustainability. They care about workplace experience more than ever. So you have to kind of look yourself in the mirror and evaluate, really carefully what the right investment decisions are for your asset to stay competitive.
Well, I know as we're having conversations with the landlords and the occupiers, a lot of what is expected now, the data is a key thing. I think COVID, it really exposed the lack of data strategy that a lot of organizations had. And we had through that time, just a acceleration of the need of getting the right technology, the right data portability in play within these assets. So because these leasing agreements, you're starting to see things like data as a service become more and more prominent. You mentioned ESG and getting the ESG reporting. Now you have tenants that they won't even occupy a building if that landlord isn't aligned with their ESG strategy. There's table stakes here. And I know one key thing that is just general table stakes nowadays for any young employee coming into these environments is just having connectivity, being able to access the internet from anywhere within the building. But outside of those things, so we talked about data, we talked about ESG reporting, we talked about just briefly the data portability aspect, and then the connectivity piece. But what are the other things that you're seeing as a trend that occupiers and employees are expecting for them when they come back into these environments?
Yeah, I'll caveat that table stakes and expectation versus reality aren't always, equally married. Connectivity is a good example. Like we still have buildings in New York that are delivering, and everywhere in the world that are delivering that, as a corporate tenant, you need always on connectivity. You need redundancy of your service. You need to be able to make a phone call in a building, right? Like simple stuff. That's still a problem. We still see buildings coming out of the ground where day two, the property manager is panicking because all of their tenants in the building are complaining that they can't make a phone call. So that stuff is still, it's obviously table stakes, and it's being driven into lease requirements now to really move the market, which you'll see happening more and more kind of across the full stack of things that we're talking about here. But
I
elsewhere,
imagine people get pretty mad if they can't play Candy Crush while they're on the pot.
yeah, man, I had an entire building in Jersey City, which was up for a lease renewal, and terrible cell phone coverage. We had told them that, and they didn't want to action it. And then ultimately the CEO of the anchor tenant couldn't make a call from the bathroom, couldn't use it. He said making a call, couldn't use his phone from the bathroom. And they drew that into the lease agreement. They drew that into a renewal concession. They had to install, distribute an antenna system to get that, 10-year lease for a 400,000 square foot tenant, major bank in the New York market. And, that stuff is powerful when you can actually bake that into a lease. Yeah. You're seeing that on the smart side of things now as well, right? So like the day in the life exercise, if you're a workplace experience team, which like most occupiers have workplace experience teams now, which is great to see. You kind of have to handle a workforce in a hybrid environment. Most of them are kind of going through that exercise at a building level of like, what are my employees going to feel and experience when they enter the building? How do they enter the building? How do you check visitors in? How do you access information about building amenities? How do you book building amenities? How do I know what's happening within the building from a programming standpoint in the neighborhood at a local level? Those are things that were like historically the kind of the fluffy talking points in the space, right? It's a lot of like bells and whistles and flashy, use cases that you can enable. But I think workplace, experience teams are looking for those things now, right? Like we see that in the data. Like we evaluate our data across the buildings that are pursuing certification. We see what use cases they're actually pursuing and delivering on. And 3/4 of our clients are prioritizing, those kind of simple, come into the building, get up to my floor, engage with the building experiences that technology ultimately enables. So I think you're going to see more and more of that from a leasing standpoint, kind of being front and center, where that becomes a requirement for you to compete. You have to have those things enabled for employers and employees to get them into the building, because it makes lives easier, it removes friction. And it's a selling point for an employer.
Well, you have to make the ability for someone to come to the office as seamless and as easy as possible. If it's difficult for them to come to the office, they're going to be more hesitant to come in there. But that one use case of getting someone from their dashboard to their seat, right, is a very hairy, very complex process, because you have a number of different base building systems. You have the tenant level systems just with access control, right? Yeah. You got a parking system. You've got base building access control. You've got the vertical lift and elevator system. Then you have the tenant level, right? So then you're looking at a workplace app that's going to encompass digital credentials across all of those different systems that's going to be housed in one app. That's a very complex thing for someone to enable. Plus, you have to have buy-in both from the landlord, from the base building systems, and you have to have buy-in from every single tenant that has their own potential unique access control system.
That's the other one, right? Is that what if I'm a tenant that has my own workplace app and I want to integrate with your access control system, right?
Right.
Those are the things that you can, and what we see happening through our conversations with landlords, those are things you can be intentional about as long as you know what use cases you want to enable, right? You can be intentional with those integrations, design decisions, the procurement process. So I think you'll see more and more of that happening just earlier in the process to kind of enable those buildings to compete, especially for, redevelopments, new construction, Class A coming out of the ground.
Well, how are they handling it, John? So, they may not, if you're looking at new development, they may not even have an idea of who's going to occupy that space. So what is that kind of baseline technology infrastructure and amenity that a developer can put in there that makes that space ready for whoever's going to occupy that space?
Yeah, it's the ultimate question, right? Especially in North America in particular, most of our developments are core and shell, meaning we're going to start, designing and building before we have a clear understanding of who our tenancy is. In Europe, smaller buildings, not necessarily the case. You typically have kind of an understanding of your users going into the design process, which is great. Built to suit is the same. For developers that are kind of starting on this early, for us, it's about being kind of really intentional with the underlying system components that can enable those use cases. So, ensuring you have the right foundational, integration network in place to, leverage all those complex integrations between systems, enable those complex integrations between systems that you mentioned. From a procurement standpoint, ensuring that if you are onboarding, a tenant app, you actually understand what the API capability of that tenant app is for the, for the large corporate occupier that's coming into the space and actually wants to onboard their own, but integrate that into some of the functionality that you have. So for us, it's a lot of the foundational components that you can kind of get right early, and through the design process, start to kind of build that into Division 25 specifications and beyond. And have kind of a clear understanding of here's what my day one functionality will be. If my tenants require X, here's what day two can be, and here's what the uplift cost of that is. You should have a baseline where you truly understand exactly kind of what that pathway of increasing the level of functionality that you enable for those users looks like. The starting point is kind of getting the bare components right, getting a lot of the kind of the less sexy stuff that's in the background, but being intentional within the design to enable those outcomes.
Well, and it's one thing to have the design there, and then like right now, it's tough, right? So we're in a kind of a paradox of a moment in history where you've got these owners of this real estate whose revenues are hemorrhaging, asset values are decreasing in double-digit percentages, right? Your occupancy rates are low. So you're short on cash, but here we are telling you, well, you need to invest in your infrastructure, right? You need to put it smart so that you can attract the next tenant, right? But we're telling you to invest in a time where the money's down. So why would they go down that path? Why invest in smart infrastructure outside of the obvious of attracting tenants? But what are the other things that asset managers and owners need to be thinking about on the why behind investing in smart strategy?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of the historical starting point for most landlords, from what I've seen, has been operational savings and energy efficiency, like kind of first and foremost, right? Before we kind of started talking about tenant experience, occupier experience in the way that we do now, and before that became more front and center in leasing decisions, operational efficiency, energy efficiency, is a need of the majority of our building stock, right? We're in a market now where most major corporate occupiers have committed to some form of net zero by a specific date. We're in a market where, depending on what market you sit in, energy costs are up 10 to, as high as 40% from where they were 3 years ago. So the business case is very compelling just in the kind of the operational aspect, the O&M infrastructure upgrades to improve and optimize energy efficiency within your building, which ultimately, gives you more flexibility with the asset. You're, impacting your bottom line, increasing the NOI of the asset, ultimately how profitable your asset is. I've heard from some clients, a payback on energy optimization in years past was a several year payback period, several year ROI. Of late, that's, as little as 3 to 6 months because the cost escalation. So especially if you're a long-term holder, right? If you're not moving in and out of these assets on a regular basis and you're sitting on them, which is a lot of, the building stock in a lot of our major cities, you have that sort of ownership structure. It's pretty compelling to make those investment business cases because there's some kind of massive fat to cut into as it relates to the spend. And that's a starting point, right? You start layering in some of those technologies and you can start, having serious conversations about the rest of it. And I think I think that's where you're seeing, a lot of the kind of operational side of the market shift to in 2023 and beyond, where, tenant experience super important. You're going to have to do something to compete, but operational, excellence and profitability may just be the livelihood of your asset. So that is a pretty compelling value proposition and business case for a lot of landlords, I think.
Well, and John, if I'm a landlord and if I have my team that's telling me you need to invest in this, right? Is it reasonable for me to expect like a higher price per square foot if I do go down that path?
I think data supports that. Like every survey that I see, we just did a survey of 1,000 real estate decision makers saying, they would spend 5% more for a smart enabled office. Like the data supports that. Ultimately, I think it like comes down to the tenant and it comes down to the negotiation process. I think you have an opportunity as a landlord, especially an existing asset, to have a serious conversation about either existing tenants or prospective tenants about, favorable lease terms for both landlord and tenant to reduce that kind of operational output. Most leases, a landlord is passing through, 80% of those energy costs directly to the tenants, right? But these tenants have made public commitments. They want to reduce their carbon, operational carbon footprint. They want to report on that footprint and kind of trend line over time of how much they've improved. So I think you'll see more, what we call green lease terms, green lease amendments, especially within renewals, to have a mutual dialogue and a mutual understanding and financial agreement between landlord and tenant that kind of enables more and more of those, more and more of those investment decisions. And ultimately, that could increase the per square foot costs at each asset. But ultimately, I think that's going to be a cost of doing business and a cost of retaining tenants.
Oh, for sure. Oh, did you hear that sound? No, I didn't hear it either. So you know what that means? That means it's time for our poll.
Cool.
So everyone, I am going to post up a poll for you. Love to hear your feedback. And as we're doing this, also, if you have any questions that you want to throw at me or John, go ahead and go in the Q&A. We're going to talk about the poll results once that's done. And then we'll do a quick Q&A before we wrap up for the day. Now, while everyone's doing that, John, you got any dad jokes you want to throw my way?
You go ahead. Why don't you do the honors?
All right, I've got one for you. So did you hear the one about the office owner who didn't invest in their smart infrastructure?
No, I have not.
Their buildings are last but not least.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
No, it was
good. Actually got one for my team. Two Wi-Fi routers got married. The reception was amazing.
Nice.
Even worse. It's even worse.
Oh, got my special Valentine's coffee mug for today too.
Nice. Yeah, as a new father, I surprisingly haven't been.
You got to work on the dad jokes, man.
Yeah.
How old's your kiddo now?
6 months.
6 months. So
old enough where he doesn't know how bad my sense of humor is, but soon to come.
No, the greatest thing is when, as your kiddo gets a little bit older and they're actually able to listen to your kids, are going to think that you're the funniest person in the world, but your wife's just going to tell you you're stupid.
Well, yeah, that's a constant. That's a constant.
All right, I'm going to give this about 30 more seconds, everyone, as the questions are coming in. Again, if you have any particular questions you want to ask John or myself after we go through the poll questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A.
To your last point as well, I just remember the rental rate for One Vanderbilt, which is a premier office tower that just came out of the ground in New York and opened at the height of the pandemic, which couldn't have been worse. I think the majority of their leases were over $200 a square foot, which was a historic high. And that's just like a case study of like those elements of close to commute, excellent amenities, amazing technology, people are paying more for that, right? To check all those boxes.
So you think Spirit Halloween's going to get an uptick and going to move out of retail and move into office space with all the vacancy?
That's what all of these, I've seen that meme where all of these facilities are just Spirit Halloween moving forward.
Just hanging from the side of the building.
Get your costumes.
All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and end the poll. I'll share the results with everyone. So the first question we had is, does your company have a well-documented smart building strategy? We see the majority here. It's the Wild West over here. Yeehaw, y'all. So I would say that's an emphatic no. We got a couple in here that have a very well-documented smart building strategy. I would say that's probably the outlier for sure. I know a lot of the companies that I've spoken with, this last one here is when there's companies that have a tendency to, they may have some baseline owners requirements and then they just pass it over to the GC, and some of those owner requirements are adhered to, some are not. At the end of the day, the GC kind of just sits back on their druthers of what they're comfortable and what they did previously for you, which creates a lot of different problems just around consistency across your portfolio, which that breeds all sorts of different challenges, right? If you want to get all of your data in one place, you want everything, semantically aligned so that the data all means the same thing across the portfolio. It just creates a lot of different challenges. But John, do you have any thoughts around that one?
Yeah, we see it all day long on kind of both the connectivity side of the fence and the smart building side of the fence. It's my favorite. I mean, a big part of what we're doing is reviewing designs, right? We see copy and paste designs or riser stack plans from project to project that don't even line up with the number of floors in the building. Completely different font used in the design. Ultimately, any sort of OPR checklist or owner, integration requirements checklist. It's unless someone's checking the homework, it's kind of a fool's errand. I think you're going to see a lot of misses on that from my experience.
Yeah. Then just curious on why people joined today. I'm glad that there are some people interested in the dad jokes and my hairstyle. So it takes a long time to get this ready for camera. So appreciate that. Let's see if there's anything that came up from the Q&A. Let me stop sharing there. All right, we got a couple of questions. Our industry has a tendency to talk more about the technologies side versus the business and economic side. I certainly agree with that. Having come from the prop tech world, I led sales for two different prop tech companies that they were both widgets or technology for real estate. There was always a bad habit, both from leadership, and I'll be guilty of it myself, just wearing the sales hat of being very focused on the technology itself, and it can do all of these amazing things, whether the company can prove it or not, which you see very often in early stage prop tech, which our industry is inundated with. But when you think about the economics and you think about the business, right? Companies care about outcomes. They don't buy products, they buy outcomes, right? So what are you going to do for me? How are you going to lower my OpEx? How are you going to make the experiences for my tenants or my employees better? I think the conferences are very guilty of this as well. You see hear a lot of theory. You hear a lot of it'd be cool ifs, versus seeing a lot or hearing a lot of tangible and actual results from a technology being implemented, executed, and showing the end product. I'm a subject matter expert on digital twin technology, right? But have seldomly seen digital twins effectively implemented across a portfolio, even just in a couple of properties. And depending on who you speak to, they'll talk digital twins till they're blue in the face, but they don't actually know what a digital twin is, what its purpose is, or how they're going to utilize it, what outcomes they're going to achieve by implementing said digital twin. And at the end of the day, what they end up asking for a building operating system, they're not even asking for a digital twin. And you could ask me, you can ask 50 other subject matter experts on digital twins what one is, and you'll probably get 50 different answers. So, Mark, that was a great question, but that's kind of my 2 cents on that. John, you have any thoughts around it?
Yeah, I mean, we have basically designed our framework to be fully focused on the outcomes and the users, right? Like kind of use that as a starting point, go through what what do you want to enable for the users of your building, and then we can back into the technology aspect of that. If you've ever taken the kind of the Nexus James Dice course on foundations, it's that idea of jumping to technology, right? And I have conversations with asset managers and owners all day long, and they sit in an interesting pitch from a prop tech company and they're hooked. It's like, let's use that occupancy sensor because it's the best occupancy sensor, but they're not ever really thinking holistically about how they can leverage that for more value creation at the asset level. How can you use that to integrate with your VAS and HVAC system for real-time energy monitoring and optimization? How can you leverage that with IAQ to kind of create healthier buildings and position that better to the market? So I think the pointed solution approach is kind of dying on the vine at this point, because I think the industry at large has been inundated with solutions that aren't really focused necessarily on kind of holistic user experience for all the users of the building. So that's kind of the key missing point in that process.
Well, I think a really good example is the workplace experience apps, right? Great in theory, very poor in adoption and execution, right? From most of the workplace experience apps that I've had the pleasure of either using myself or partnering with, right? When you look at the number one use case of a workplace experience app, it's mobile access.
Access control. That's the hook.
Hands down, the number one use case for a employee facing app. However, you know how many employee facing apps have that native within their own app, John?
Very few.
Exactly. The reason for that is because having to integrate with every single access control system, having the backend integrator, not just the front end integrator across all of the backend access management system, but also all of the different readers and all the different door types and all the mag strips and all of the parking gates, right? Getting all of that cohesively into an ecosystem that is integrated and is synced on the back end and still secure and protected. That is a nightmare situation for a developer and all the APIs that have to be maintained for that. So that's a great example where you have that shiny object that companies just went after. And everyone said, I have to have an app, without even really putting into thought the integration and the data strategy all the way down to the baseline to enable all the advanced use cases that they want. So you end up reverse engineering, trying to get all of these use cases on the app, and you find out that your infrastructure doesn't even support it. The data strategy doesn't even support it. So you have all of these use cases that when you pay a very expensive consultant to help you design, then you find out you can't even enable them. So your outcomes or your exclusive experience that you're curating across that portfolio or that building starts to shrink very quickly. And a fraction of those use cases go live day one.
It was this was really around like 2018, 2019, where that was kind of blowing up. And it was, I think it was an intentionally strategic land grab for a lot of companies, because you could say that you had mobile access control in the roadmap, right? But at the end of the day, you hadn't actually done any sort of assessment of the facility to determine what that would actually look like to deploy. So I would say you're seeing a much better job of that now. I see it, across our markets, where that is a use case that you can enable, and a lot of more companies are doing that kind of off the shelf with some integration requirements. But yeah, it's definitely the historic kind of fluffy one that is underutilized at an asset level.
Well, it's a double-edged sword, John. So you have companies that went and adopted the point solution, right? They get burned on that because either the use rate doesn't get to where they were sold on where it was going to be. But at the same time, now you have a decision maker within a real estate company that got burned on a technology that they went on a limb in, or they may have even invested in, or they may have just rolled it out across a very large percentage of the portfolio, and then that solution just dies on the vine, right? Or they get acquired by somebody that you don't even like, and you don't want to do business with, right? You get into a whole risk mitigation conversation now, so that when the decision makers are looking at the next thing, or they're looking at this broader ecosystem strategy, right? I think it's creating an additional element in our industry of making technology adoption slow.
Yeah.
We're already bad about it. And I think stuff like this just makes it that much worse.
Yeah, I mean, you really have to do your diligence on what you're onboarding, right? What you're procuring, and it's a crowded market. It's a challenging market to navigate. It's time intensive to navigate. So it's you have to really be pretty deliberate in your procurement decisions and ensure you're pretty thorough in that evaluation process.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any other questions coming through. We're coming up on our time, John. Absolutely tremendous. Appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today and just talk shop. I'm going to share for everyone a little bit of information. For those of you who enjoyed today's show, we're going to be doing our next episode with my friend Byron Lopez, who is over at Kilroy. So come and join us at 2 p.m. on March 16th. If you want to get in contact with the fine folks over at WiredScore, you can see their information here. If you have any interest in having a chat with Intelligent Buildings, you have any needs that we can support you on and meet you where you are in your real estate technology journey, feel free to reach out to either myself, or you can utilize the links that you see here to get in touch with us. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. Just hope you all have a great rest of your week and hope you enjoyed the dad jokes. Thank you.
Kyle. Thanks, man. Thank you, everyone.